The bold move. It was supposed to be a simple mission. The Kalteri had targeted a single human ship, expecting an easy conquest. The human species, in the eyes of the galaxy's dominant civilizations, was a joke, a primitive race with no real power. But this story would prove them wrong. The human ship, the Endurance, was a lone vessel moving slowly through the outskirts of the galaxy, near a quiet trade route. It was just another vessel on a seemingly routine journey, carrying precious supplies to a distant human colony. There was nothing special about the ship to the Kalteri, nothing that screamed danger or threat. It looked like the perfect target, small, vulnerable, and isolated. But the Kalteri didn't know the humans. They didn't know Earth. They didn't understand the depths of the power that humankind held, buried deep within their history, and just waiting for the right moment to awaken. And this was that moment. As the Kalteri fleet moved closer, they deployed their attack. The first shots were fired without hesitation, tearing into the quiet emptiness of space. The humans had no defense, they assumed, and the Kalteri were certain that victory was in their grasp. But as the first wave of missiles sped toward the human ship, something unexpected happened. The Endurance didn't explode. It didn't break apart. Instead, the ship's hull shimmered with an unfamiliar energy, and the missiles were deflected, like water flowing around rocks. For a brief moment, the Kalteri paused, confused. This wasn't supposed to happen. They'd fired everything they had at this small ship, yet it was still standing. Then the ship's engines roared to life, and the Kalteri saw something even more shocking. The Endurance didn't run. It didn't try to escape, as they expected it to. No, the human ship turned to face its attackers, and in that moment, the Kalteri realized their mistake. They had just declared war on the wrong species. The Endurance's weapon systems activated. The quiet hum of advanced technology filled the air. The human ship unleashed a barrage of firepower so intense, it was almost impossible to comprehend. The first few Kalteri ships were caught off guard, their shields crumbling before they could even raise any sort of defense. The Kalteri didn't know how it was possible, but the human ship was firing weapons that were far beyond anything they had ever seen. The Kalteri's initial confusion turned to fear. Their ships were being torn apart, one, by a single human vessel. They had expected the humans to be weak, easy prey, but instead, the human ship's counterattack was swift and relentless. A calm, almost eerie voice crackled through the communication channels of the Kalteri fleet, demanding that they surrender. It wasn't a threat, but a warning. The voice belonged to the captain of the Endurance, a human named Commander Alex Monroe. His voice was steady, like a man who had seen this moment coming long before the Kalteri had. His crew, though facing what should have been certain death, stood by him without fear. "We are not the species you think we are," Commander Monroe's voice echoed in the Kalteri fleet's communication system. "You made a grave mistake. This will not be your victory." The Kalteri leaders were in chaos. What they had assumed would be a quick victory had turned into their worst nightmare. The Endurance wasn't the only human ship out there. This ship was just the beginning. The battle raged on, and with each passing minute, the Kalteri fleet grew smaller. The human ship's weapon systems, designed from centuries of hidden Earth technology, decimated the Kalteri's forces. For every ship the Kalteri destroyed, 5 more human ships appeared, emerging from hidden stations and forgotten Earth colonies. What the Kalteri didn't realize was that humanity had been preparing for this moment for generations. They had been planning for their return to space, their rebirth in the galaxy, for centuries. What seemed like a mere lonely ship was in fact the first strike of a war that had been long anticipated. The Endurance was just the beginning. As the Kalteri fleet scrambled to recover, their communications flooded with panic and confusion. No one had expected this kind of response. No one had even thought it possible for the humans to fight back in such a way. But here they were, fighting back with the full force of Earth's most secret technologies. The Kalteri fleet began to retreat, but they were too late. The Endurance wasn't just surviving. It was dismantling their entire fleet. They had underestimated Earth's people, and they were now paying the price. What had started as a routine mission to capture a vulnerable human ship had turned into a galactic disaster. And for the Kalteri, it was only the beginning of a war they were destined to lose. The humans had just declared their arrival in the galaxy, and it would not be an easy fight for anyone who stood in their way. As the Kalteri ships retreated, their commanders were left wondering the same thing. What had they awakened? The answer, they were about to find out, would change the galaxy forever. The Kalteri fleet was in disarray. They had come expecting an easy conquest, but what they had faced was far beyond their expectations. The Endurance had devastated their forces, and now, as their ships limped back to their home world, they were haunted by one undeniable truth. Humanity was not the primitive species they thought they were. The Kalteri had underestimated Earth. What they didn't know was that the humans had been preparing for this moment for hundreds of years. While the rest of the galaxy had dismissed Earth as a backwater world, humanity had quietly and methodically built an empire of technology, knowledge, and strength that could now rival the greatest civilizations in the galaxy. They had not been weak. They had simply been waiting. As the retreating Kalteri ships fled into the deep reaches of space, they were unaware that their mistake had only just begun to unfold. They had awakened something ancient, something more powerful than they could possibly comprehend. And now, Earth's fury was about to be unleashed in ways they never expected. Back on Earth, the leaders of the planet watched in stunned silence as the human ship, the Endurance, transmitted its victory to the world. Commander Monroe's voice echoed across the Earth's communications network, a signal of humanity's return to prominence in the galaxy. "We stand united," Monroe's voice said, "and we will not back down. The galaxy will know our strength." Across Earth, people cheered. For the first time in centuries, the people of Earth felt a surge of pride. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about thriving, reclaiming their place in the stars. But even as the celebrations began, no one realized just how quickly things were about to escalate. Humanity's strength was not just in their technology. It was in their unity. Every human on Earth now felt connected to the fight, connected to the stars, and connected to the Endurance's victory. Across every corner of the planet, people began preparing, not just for defense, but for offense. Earth had been underestimated, but now they were preparing to prove that underestimating them was the greatest mistake any alien species could make. The Kalteri were still recovering from the Endurance's destruction, but their leaders had a plan. They wouldn't go down without a fight. They had vast resources, a powerful fleet, and thousands of years of experience. They began to regroup, sending messages to their allies across the galaxy, preparing to strike back. But even as they planned their counteroffensive, the Kalteri commanders knew one thing for certain. Their previous assumptions about humanity were wrong. The humans they had attacked weren't the helpless, weak species they'd believed. And now they had awakened a force that would be difficult to defeat. The Kalteri had made an enemy that they might not be able to stop. Meanwhile, humanity was preparing for the next move. What had begun as a single ship defending itself had now become a full-scale mobilization. The Endurance was just the first wave of a massive human response. The Earth fleet, once thought to be a relic of a forgotten era, was coming back to life. In the deepest bunkers and secret military bases around the planet, the most advanced technology ever created was being activated. Ships, weapons, and tactics thought to be nothing more than legend were now being brought to the forefront. The humans were no longer trying to hide. They were ready to fight. Commander Monroe stood on the bridge of the Endurance, staring at the star map. They were preparing to track down every Kalteri fleet that had escaped and end this war before it could spread. Monroe's eyes were calm, but there was a fire in his gaze. He knew that the Kalteri would never expect what was coming. They had made a grave mistake, and the consequences would be far worse than they could ever imagine. As Monroe addressed his crew, He didn't speak of glory or conquest. He spoke of survival. He spoke of a species that had been pushed too far, a species that had fought against insurmountable odds for centuries, and now had the means to push back with devastating force. "This is our moment," Monroe said. "We may have only one shot at this. The galaxy is vast, and the enemies are many. But we have something they don't: the will to survive, and the strength to make them regret underestimating us." The crew of the Endurance nodded in silent agreement. They were ready. The war was no longer just about defending their world. It was about defending the very idea of Earth, and the Kalteri were only the beginning. But even as humanity prepared for the next phase of the war, the Kalteri were already mobilizing. They weren't going to let a single human ship change the course of the galaxy. They had underestimated Earth once, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. The Kalteri were coming back with a vengeance, and this time they would bring allies. Little did they know, however, that humanity had already begun forming their own alliances. The war that had started with a single ship would soon escalate into something far greater, a galaxy-spanning conflict that would forever change the balance of power. The Kalteri might have thought they were in control, but the moment they declared war on the wrong species was the moment they sealed their fate. The Kalteri fleet was scattered across the galaxy, recovering from the stunning defeat they had suffered at the hands of a single human ship, the Endurance. It was a fleet of proud warriors, but they were now licking their wounds, unsure of what to do next. They had misjudged humanity, and now they were feeling the consequences of their arrogance. But they were not alone. The Kalteri were not a race that could easily be defeated. They were cunning, and they had allies. The galaxy was vast, and many species stood ready to take advantage of the chaos. It wasn't just the Kalteri who had an interest in the war that had now started. It was every species that had ever looked down on humanity. Every species that had ignored Earth's potential now had a stake in the outcome. Commander Monroe of the Endurance knew that the victory over the Kalteri was just the beginning. Humanity had made its presence known, but the real challenge was just beginning. Monroe looked out over the fleet of ships that had now gathered, ready for the next phase. The Endurance was no longer alone. Earth's ships were now spread across the galaxy, patrolling the stars, looking for any Kalteri remnants, and preparing for the worst. Monroe's mind raced. The Kalteri had retreated, but they had not been defeated. He knew that the moment the Kalteri regrouped, they would return with overwhelming force. It was only a matter of time before the galaxy would see the full might of the Kalteri Empire. The Endurance had sent a clear message, but the Kalteri would not take defeat lying down. Monroe's eyes narrowed. They would come for humanity again, and this time, Earth would be ready. As the fleet moved further into Kalteri space, Monroe's comms officer received an unexpected transmission from an unknown source. The message was clear but cryptic. "The galaxy is not what you think it is, Commander. You may have won a battle, but the war is much larger than you realize." The transmission cut off before Monroe could respond, leaving more questions than answers. He wasn't sure whether the message was a threat, a warning, or something else entirely. But one thing was certain: Earth was about to become the center of a galaxy-wide conflict. Monroe could feel it in his bones. Humanity's simple existence was no longer just a matter of survival. It had become a symbol, a beacon that was calling attention from every corner of the galaxy. Despite the ominous warning, Monroe couldn't afford to pause. Earth had to strike while it had the momentum. His fleet continued its pursuit of the Kalteri, and their next target was a Kalteri stronghold deep in uncharted space. If they could destroy it, they could cut off the Kalteri's resources and cripple their ability to strike back. But as the fleet neared the stronghold, something strange happened. The stars ahead flickered, and the vastness of space seemed to warp. Monroe's sensors picked up an enormous energy surge coming from a distant point. Something massive was approaching. "Alert all ships," Monroe ordered. "Brace for incoming contact." The fleet quickly went into battle formation as the source of the energy surge came into view. What Monroe saw next took his breath away. A colossal armada appeared, seemingly from nowhere. The ships were unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Massive, imposing, and equipped with weapons far beyond anything the humans had in their arsenal. This wasn't the Kalteri fleet. This was something different, something much worse. Before Monroe could react, his comms officer called out, "Commander, we're getting another transmission. This one from the new fleet." The transmission came through loud and clear. "You have declared war on the wrong species, humans. Prepare yourselves for annihilation." Monroe's pulse quickened as he stared at the enormous armada. The voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the threat behind it. Humanity's fight had just gone from bad to worse. This new enemy was not just powerful. They were prepared, and they were coming for Earth. Monroe's mind raced as the enemy ships began to approach. Who were they? What did they want? He couldn't answer these questions right now. All he knew was that the fate of humanity was now in the balance, and the coming battle would determine whether Earth's resurgence was a spark of hope or the beginning of the end. "Prepare all weapons," Monroe ordered, his voice steady. "We're not going down without a fight." As the unknown armada closed in, Monroe felt the weight of the moment press down on him. The Kalteri were nothing compared to what they now faced, and as the first salvo of enemy fire lit up the void, Monroe knew one thing for certain. The fight for humanity's survival was just beginning. The Endurance's engines roared as it turned to face the oncoming threat. Monroe's eyes locked onto the vast armada before him. The galaxy had underestimated Earth once, and now humanity was about to make it clear, again, that no one, not even the mightiest of species, would ever make the same mistake twice. The war had truly begun, and this time it wouldn't just be Earth's survival on the line. It would be the galaxy's very future. The fleet stood in absolute silence, save for the hum of engines and the occasional crackling of static from the comms channels. The unknown armada had surrounded them, and Commander Monroe knew this was no ordinary battle. The ships before them were far beyond anything the Kalteri had ever possessed, and yet the humans stood their ground. As the massive enemy fleet advanced, Monroe ordered his fleet into battle formation. The Endurance's weapon systems powered up, its shields flickered with energy, and the hum of laser cannons charging was almost deafening. He wasn't sure who these new enemies were, but there was no time to waste. They had come to challenge humanity, and they were going to find out just how difficult that challenge would be. "Commence fire." Monroe's voice rang through the comms, his hand steady on the controls as the first volley of laser beams shot from the Endurance. The first shots were met with a chilling response. The enemy ships didn't even flinch. The beams of energy that struck them dissipated into nothing, absorbed by their imposing shields. It was as if the lasers had hit a solid wall, and the massive ships continued their advance, undeterred. "Commander," came the voice of the fleet's lead tactical officer, Lieutenant Jessa. "Their shields are absorbing our fire. We need to find a weakness, or we'll be outgunned in minutes." Monroe's mind raced. The technology these ships possessed was far beyond humanity's capabilities. They had no choice but to adapt, to find a way to exploit any vulnerability. But he was beginning to realize that this enemy was playing by an entirely different set of rules. Suddenly, the enemy ships launched a devastating counterattack. Missiles flew through the air, their engines screaming as they shot toward the human fleet. Monroe barely had time to react before the first explosion rocked the Endurance. The ship shuddered as the blast sent waves of pressure through its hull. Monroe's grip tightened on the controls, but the ship held strong. They had prepared for damage, but the intensity of the enemy's strikes was unlike anything they'd seen. The Endurance's shields flared bright as they absorbed some of the impacts, but others tore through the energy barriers, sending sparks flying across the bridge. "Damage report," Monroe barked, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Shields at 75%, Lieutenant Jessa replied, her hands flying across the tactical controls. "Hull integrity is holding for now, but we can't take many more hits like that." Monroe's gaze narrowed. He wasn't just fighting for Earth anymore. The future of the galaxy had just been put on the line. This was no longer just about winning a battle. It was about proving humanity's place in the universe. "We need to get closer," Monroe said. "If we're going to do any real damage, we need to close the gap and get inside their range." Jessa nodded, already setting the course. The Endurance surged forward, its engines burning hot as the ship plowed toward the enemy fleet. As they neared, the enemy's fire became even more concentrated, but the humans were quick, dodging and weaving through the storm of missiles and laser blasts. The Endurance's turrets fired relentlessly, but the enemy ships remained impenetrable. The humans were fighting hard, but it was becoming clear that sheer firepower wasn't going to win this battle. But Monroe wasn't done yet. He had a plan, and it was risky, but it was the only chance they had. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Monroe shouted, just as a new set of missiles locked onto them. The Endurance executed a sharp turn, dodging the incoming missiles with expert precision. In the midst of the chaos, Monroe's eyes scanned the enemy ships. He noted their movement patterns and the gaps in their formation. There was a weakness, a tiny opening in their defense, one that could give them a fighting chance. "Take us in, Lieutenant. Full speed," Monroe commanded. Jessa's hands were quick on the controls as the Endurance tore through space, angling toward the gap in the enemy fleet. The ship's engines roared, and the hum of weapons charging filled the air once more. The next few seconds felt like hours as the Endurance cut through the enemy's defenses, now only moments away from reaching the gap. Then, as if everything slowed down, the fleet's weapons unleashed a devastating barrage. The Endurance fired every weapon it had, missiles, lasers, plasma, filling the space with a storm of deadly energy. The enemy fleet retaliated, but it was too late. The Endurance was already inside the gap, weaving through the oncoming fire like a storm cutting through the calm. The human ship's attack hit its mark. There was a moment of silence, a second, and then the enemy ships began to fall. Explosions rippled through their ranks, and the once imposing fleet that had seemed unstoppable began to falter. Monroe watched as one of the enemy ships exploded in a fiery ball. The Endurance had done the impossible. They had struck back. But Monroe knew this victory was only temporary. The enemy was vast, and this was just the first round of a much larger war. "Commander," Lieutenant Jessa said, her voice filled with disbelief, "we've done it. They're retreating." Monroe nodded grimly. "For now, but don't get comfortable. We've only just begun." As the enemy ships began to fall back, Monroe stood tall, feeling the weight of the moment. He had just led humanity's first true victory in this war, but it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The galaxy had declared war on humanity, but humanity was fighting back. And now, every species in the stars would know one thing for sure: Earth was not a species to be underestimated. The war was on, and humanity was ready to make its mark on the galaxy. The sound of the enemy's retreat was a brief moment of relief for the Endurance and its crew. But Commander Monroe knew better than to celebrate too soon. This battle may have been won, but the war was far from over. They had managed to drive the enemy back for now, but their numbers were overwhelming, and their advanced technology made them a formidable force. Monroe stood in the command center, his gaze focused on the star maps in front of him. The map was littered with the positions of enemy fleets, and although some had retreated, others remained poised and ready for another assault. The human fleet, though victorious, had suffered heavy damage. "We've pushed them back for now, but this isn't over," Monroe muttered to himself, his fingers tapping against the console. "Commander," Lieutenant Jessa's voice broke through his thoughts. "We've received a transmission from Earth. They're sending reinforcements, more ships, more firepower, but it's going to take time to get here." Monroe nodded, understanding the implications. Time was something they didn't have. Every day that passed brought the enemy closer to regrouping and launching another attack. The Endurance, and the few remaining ships couldn't hold out forever on their own. "We need to keep them off Earth until the reinforcements arrive. We can't let them regroup," Monroe said, his voice steady despite the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "Prepare for another offensive." As the fleet readied itself, the crew worked with a renewed sense of urgency. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. The enemy would come back, and when they did, they would come back stronger. Within hours, the enemy ships that had retreated began to regroup, and the tension in the air was palpable. The stars outside the viewports now seemed darker, colder, as if the very galaxy itself was holding its breath. Then, as if on cue, the enemy fleet appeared once more, emerging from a nearby nebula, their ships massive and intimidating. This time, there were no retreats. The enemy had made their decision. "Target the lead ship," Monroe ordered, his voice unwavering. "This time, we hit them harder." The Endurance's weapon systems powered up, and the ship's turrets began to glow. The first volley was launched, but the enemy was prepared. Their shields flared as they absorbed the energy beams, and the retaliation came almost immediately. Missiles tore through space, their warheads flashing with deadly precision. The enemy ships were clearly faster, their movements calculated and ruthless. For a moment, it seemed as if the humans had overestimated their own strength. "We're being surrounded," Lieutenant Jessa called out. "Our weapons are ineffective against their shields. We need a new strategy." Monroe's mind raced. They had to find a way to break through the enemy's defenses before it was too late. In this moment of crisis, he realized that they couldn't win by using brute force alone. They needed to outsmart the enemy, to anticipate their moves, and exploit their weaknesses. "Jessa, bring us in closer," Monroe said, his voice calm despite the chaos unfolding around him. "We'll force them into a corner." The Endurance lurched forward, heading straight for the heart of the enemy fleet. The enemy responded with everything they had. Laser beams, missiles, and plasma bolts rained down on the ship, causing massive explosions across the hull. But the Endurance kept pushing forward, faster and faster, closing the gap between the two fleets. The crew gritted their teeth, knowing that if they didn't make it into the heart of the enemy's formation, they wouldn't make it out alive. "Braced for impact," Monroe shouted, gripping the edge of his console. The ship shook violently as an enemy missile found its mark, but the human vessel's shields held strong. The Endurance was taking a beating, but it wasn't going to stop. The closer they got to the enemy's formation, the more desperate the battle became. The ship's weapons fired relentlessly, but the enemy's shields absorbed almost every shot. Monroe knew they were on the verge of being overwhelmed. The enemy's ships were bigger, stronger, and more advanced. The humans were outmatched in almost every way, but their will to survive was greater than anything the enemy could comprehend. "Commander," Jessa's voice was filled with urgency, "we need to do something drastic, or we're not going to survive this." Monroe's eyes narrowed. The time for hesitation was over. "Prepare to initiate the Endurance's special maneuver. All power to forward shields. We go straight through." The crew worked quickly, pulling the last reserves of energy into the ship's forward shields. The Endurance's engines roared as it surged forward, cutting through space toward the heart of the enemy fleet. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. The ships in the enemy fleet scattered as the Endurance forced its way through, its shields glowing a bright blue as it absorbed the incoming fire. Explosions rocked the enemy ships as the Endurance plodded forward, the hull scraping against the massive vessels that stood in its path. And then, as if by some miracle, the Endurance broke through. For the first time in the battle, the humans found themselves in the center of the enemy fleet. It was chaos, a deadly dance of laser fire and missile launches. The Endurance had broken their formation, and now it was their turn to strike. "Target their engines," Monroe ordered. "Disable their power sources." The Endurance fired its remaining weapons with deadly precision, targeting the weak spots in the enemy ships. Explosions erupted, and the first of the massive ships began to fall. The tide was turning. But the battle was far from over. The humans had made their mark, but the enemy wasn't done yet. The war was far from over, and now, humanity had shown the galaxy that it wasn't just a species to be ignored. It was a force to be reckoned with. But as the Endurance cut through the heart of the enemy fleet, Commander Monroe knew this was just the beginning. The fight for the galaxy was on, and humanity had only just begun to fight back. The battle raged on, but the human fleet, battered and bruised, had managed to inflict serious damage on the enemy. The Endurance, still holding its ground after its daring maneuver, was surrounded by a sea of wreckage and the debris of enemy ships. Yet the victory was only partial. The enemy had been dealt a significant blow, but their relentless aggression showed no signs of slowing down. Commander Monroe stood in the command center of the Endurance, surveying the battlefield. The star maps before him showed a still formidable enemy force, with ships regrouping and closing in. He knew they had bought themselves some time, but time was running out. "Report," Monroe commanded, his voice sharp and commanding. "Shields are holding at 45%, Commander," Jessa replied, her fingers flying over the controls. "But we can't take another direct hit like that. We've got to find a way to end this." Monroe's mind raced. The enemy was relentless, and the reinforcements from Earth were still too far away. His crew was exhausted, but the enemy would give them no mercy. The human fleet had proved that it could fight, but could it survive? "Status of the fleet?" Monroe asked. "Scattered," Jessa replied. "We've lost several smaller ships. The survivors are scattered, but they're holding positions around us. It's not enough. We need a decisive blow." Monroe's gaze shifted to the map, the locations of their fleet's remaining ships blinking on the display. There were only a few left in working condition. The enemy was only moments away from delivering another crushing attack. As if on cue, an alarm blared throughout the Endurance. It was the unmistakable sound of enemy warships coming in fast. "They're attacking again," Jessa shouted. Monroe's heart skipped a beat. "Prepare for impact," he barked. "All hands, brace for combat." The ship shook violently as enemy fire pounded against its shields. The Endurance staggered, but its shields held, just barely. Monroe could feel the strain in the ship's movements, but he refused to show weakness. The humans were not going down without a fight. "Commander, I have an idea," Jessa said quickly, her voice full of urgency. "If we can lure the enemy into the asteroid field ahead, we might be able to use it to our advantage. We can force them into tight spaces, disrupt their formations, and maybe get in a few surprise hits." Monroe stared at the asteroid field on the map. It was risky, but it was their only option. The enemy would be expecting another direct assault, and if they could pull it off, the element of surprise could work in their favor. "Do it," Monroe ordered. "Prepare to jump to the asteroid field. We'll take them by surprise." The Endurance lurched forward, narrowly avoiding a barrage of enemy missiles. The crew worked quickly, and within seconds, the ship was speeding toward the asteroid field at full throttle. The massive asteroids ahead were a deadly maze of rock and debris, perfect for a surprise attack, but also dangerous for both sides. As they approached, Monroe couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision. This was a high-risk maneuver, and if they didn't succeed, it could spell the end for the humans. The stakes had never been higher. "Activate the cloaking system," Monroe ordered. Jessa's hands flew across the controls. "Cloaking engaged. We're invisible to the enemy." The Endurance disappeared into the asteroid field, its powerful engines silenced. Now, they were completely undetectable. The enemy, unaware of the trap, continued their advance, not knowing the Endurance was silently stalking them. For a few moments, everything was silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the ship's cloaking system. Monroe's heart raced as they waited for the right moment. The enemy fleet moved through the asteroid field, unaware of the danger lurking nearby. The human ship had to strike now, before the element of surprise was lost. The Endurance slowly moved into position behind the enemy fleet, close enough to see their ships through the asteroid gaps. They were vulnerable. This was their moment. "On my mark, open fire," Monroe commanded. Jessa nodded and whispered, "Ready." The Endurance inched closer until the enemy ships were within range. A single spark of hope flickered in Monroe's chest. They had a chance. They could do this. "Now," Monroe shouted. In an instant, the Endurance emerged from the asteroid field, its cloaking system deactivated. The ship's weapons fired with terrifying precision. First, the forward cannons fired a devastating burst of energy that slammed into the nearest enemy ship, tearing through its shields like paper. The enemy ship exploded in a brilliant burst of light. Before the enemy could react, the Endurance fired again, targeting the second ship. This time, the attack was even more precise, striking the ship's engines and causing it to fall out of formation, disabled and drifting. The human ship didn't stop. It continued to fire, using the asteroids as cover and striking at the most vulnerable points of the enemy fleet. The surprise attack threw the enemy into disarray. The human ship was small, agile, and quick, darting in and out of the asteroid field with ease, while the larger, slower enemy ships struggled to adjust. The enemy fleet was falling apart before their eyes. "Keep going," Monroe shouted. "Don't let up. We can win this." But the battle wasn't over. The enemy regrouped, and despite their losses, they weren't finished yet. They were angry, desperate, and they were coming for the Endurance with everything they had. The tide of the battle was shifting, but the humans weren't done. They had proven they could take on the enemy in the most unexpected way. And for the first time in this war, the enemy was on the back foot. Monroe's heart pounded as he watched the unfolding chaos. This was it. This was the turning point. The fight for the galaxy had only just begun, and humanity was proving it could stand toe-to-toe with the most powerful species in the universe. The battlefield was now a war zone, littered with the wreckage of ships, debris from the shattered remnants of once proud enemy fleets, and the faint glow of burning wreckage in the distance. The Endurance, though battered, was still standing strong. Monroe's crew had defied expectations, striking with precision and strength that no one had predicted. The battle wasn't over yet, but humanity had made their mark. "Status." Monroe's voice rang out as he stood on the bridge, looking at the monitors that flashed with information. His pulse quickened, but he kept his calm. The mission was far from complete. "Enemy forces are regrouping," Jessa reported, her fingers flying over the controls. "They're not done yet, Commander. They'll come at us again." Monroe's eyes narrowed. The enemy, although damaged, were still formidable. Their ships were larger, better equipped, and there were more of them. But they were now facing something they had not anticipated: human resolve. The humans had taken the fight to them, and the enemy was beginning to realize they had bitten off more than they could chew. "We can't let them recover," Monroe said with steely determination. "Prepare the fleet. We're going to finish this." The Endurance's cannons recharge, ready for another round. Monroe's crew had fought with everything they had, but this next phase of the battle would require something more. It was time to shift tactics. The human fleet had already shown they could be unpredictable. Now, it was time to turn that unpredictability into a weapon. Monroe quickly activated the comms, calling the scattered human ships to rally around the Endurance. They were spread thin, with only a handful of ships left in fighting shape, but it was enough. They had to capitalize on the momentum they'd built. "All ships, form up on the Endurance," Monroe ordered. "We strike together. We strike hard." The crew scrambled to get the remaining ships into formation, despite the damage they had sustained. The enemy fleet, still reeling from the surprise attacks, hadn't fully regrouped yet. This was their chance. This was the moment they would either fall or rise. As the human ships assembled around the Endurance, Monroe's eyes flicked over the map. He was calculating their next move, looking for the weakness in the enemy's formation. He knew they had the element of surprise, but they needed something more, a final, decisive strike. Then it came to him. Jessa, bring us close to that cluster of asteroids. Prepare the secondary weapons. We're going to use them as a decoy. Jessa's hands moved quickly across the control panel. A decoy. Commander, are you sure? We can't fight them straight on, Monroe said, determination in his eyes. We've got to play smart. This is our last shot to take them out. The plan was risky, but there was no turning back now. The enemy's fleet had already been thrown into chaos once, and if they could strike quickly enough, the confusion might work in their favor once again. As the Endurance and its ragtag fleet of human ships approached the asteroid field, Monroe gave the signal. The secondary weapons, smaller but powerful laser turrets hidden inside the asteroid field, were activated, sending a flurry of rapid-fire shots toward the approaching enemy. The blasts struck the asteroids, sending them into a chaotic dance of explosive collisions. The enemy fleet, still recovering from the previous surprise attacks, wasn't prepared for this sudden barrage. Monroe smiled grimly. The enemy had no idea what was coming. Now, he barked. Full speed ahead. We hit them while they're distracted. In a flash, the human fleet emerged from the chaos of the asteroid field, attacking from multiple directions at once. The enemy fleet, disoriented and unable to regroup in time, was overwhelmed by the sheer speed and ferocity of the human attack. The human ships swarmed the enemy, striking at their weak points with terrifying precision. The enemy retaliated, but they were too late. The human ships had already begun their final strike, using their smaller, more agile forms to avoid the heavy enemy fire. The Endurance, leading the charge, unleashed its full firepower at the enemy flagship, a massive ship that had been the heart of the enemy's fleet. The blast was deafening. The enemy flagship exploded into a brilliant flash of light, its debris scattering in all directions. For a moment, everything stood still. It was as if the universe itself had taken a breath. But the battle wasn't over. The remaining enemy ships regrouped quickly, realizing they were on the brink of losing everything. They tried to bring their weapons to bear, but they were too scattered, too weak. Monroe knew this was their last chance. He gave the order for all remaining human ships to converge on the last of the enemy forces. The final battle would be a relentless push to the end. Give them everything we've got, Monroe commanded. The human fleet, a force forged through sheer determination and bravery, unleashed its final barrage. The enemy ships, unable to withstand the full might of humanity's war machine, began to fall one by one. The tide of the battle had completely shifted. Within moments, the enemy fleet was decimated. The last few surviving ships attempted to flee, but there was no escaping the wrath of the human fleet now. Victory was theirs. As the human ships began to regroup, their victory was clear. They had done the unthinkable. They had declared war on the wrong species, and the consequences had been devastating for the enemy. Commander Monroe stood on the bridge, surveying the aftermath. His crew was exhausted but triumphant. They had proven to the galaxy that humanity would never back down, no matter the odds. For the first time in the entire war, the enemy was no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. And the universe had learned an important lesson: never underestimate humanity.